Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The evening sun hung low over the plains, bleeding its red light across the horizon. Dust drifted in slow swirls, settling on every fence post and dry blade of grass. John Callahan wiped the sweat from his brow, leaning on the worn handle of his hoe. His cabin stood behind him, small and weathered, a reminder of years lived in silence. The boards creaked with every gust of wind, the roof patched more times than he could count. Inside, the only company was the Bible his wife had left behind and the faithful old dog stretched out by the stove. Life had narrowed to routines, mending fences, hauling water, tending to a few stubborn cattle. The land was unforgiving, but it matched the solitude he carried in his chest. He had grown used to quiet, to nights when the only sound was the wind humming against the cabin walls. That was when he noticed her. By the far post of the fence, half hidden in the haze, stood a girl. Apache by the look of her, thin as a willow switch, her hair tangled and streaked with dust. Bare feet pressed into the hard earth, skin marked by sun and hunger. She did not speak. She only pressed one hand to her stomach, cracked lips parted but too dry to form words. John froze, gripping the handle of his hoe a little tighter. The sight of a child out here, alone, carried a weight heavier than any burden the land had ever laid on him. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why. Instead, he stepped toward the gate and pushed it open. His voice came out low, almost rough from disuse. "Come in." The girl hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder at the empty prairie as though expecting someone to call her back. But the air held nothing but silence, and the faint smell of warm cornbread drifting from the cabin door caught her attention. Her eyes lit with a fragile spark of hope. Inside, John set a plate on the rough-hewn table, a thick slice of cornbread, still steaming, and a tin cup of goat's milk. The girl sat down slowly, wary at first, then reached out with trembling hands. The moment she touched the food, hunger took over. She ate quickly, as though she feared it might vanish before her eyes. John did not interrupt. He lowered himself into the chair by the stove, pipe resting between his fingers, and watched the fire crackle in the hearth. Only the sound of chewing and the snap of burning wood filled the room. When her stomach was full, the girl wrapped herself tighter in the wool blanket he had left near the fire. She lifted her eyes once, gave him the faintest nod, gratitude without words, and slipped back out into the fading light. John remained seated, staring at the flames. It had been many years since this cabin last carried the sound of a child's footsteps, and for the first time in a long while, the silence felt different. The next morning broke with a thin mist rolling over the prairie, carrying the smell of dry mesquite and old ash from last night's fire. John Callahan stepped out onto the porch, his boots scraping against the wooden boards. He scanned the fence line out of habit, expecting nothing but the familiar stretch of emptiness. Yet the memory of the girl lingered, fragile and sharp as a thorn under the skin. He found himself wondering if she had eaten since, if she had someone waiting for her beyond the hills. The thought unsettled him, not because it was strange, but because it had been so long since he had let another soul occupy his mind. He shook it off and went about his chores. The well creaked as he pulled up water, muscles straining against the rope. Cattle shifted restlessly in the corral, their lowing echoing against the open sky. He worked in silence, though his ears strained at every sound, half expecting to hear small footsteps on the gravel again. When the sun dipped low that evening, John sat alone at the table, supper untouched. His eyes drifted to the Bible resting on the shelf. Its leather was cracked, the pages thinned by years of his late wife's hands turning through them. She used to read aloud, her voice soft in the dim light of the oil lamp. One verse in particular came back to him now, unbidden, like a whisper carried on the wind. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Matthew 25:35. John let the words settle, heavier than the silence around him. He had never been much of a preacher, but his wife had lived those words every day. And though she was gone, her voice still echoed in this cabin, a reminder that kindness was never wasted. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The firelight flickered across the rough-hewn walls, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe. Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of a coyote. Inside, the loneliness pressed close, the same loneliness he had carried since the war, since burying his wife, since the land had claimed more than it ever gave back. But now there was a crack in that solitude, a child's nod, a pair of weary eyes that had looked at him not with fear, but with the faintest glimmer of trust. When he finally blew out the lamp and lay down on his bed, the silence was no longer complete. It carried with it a memory of small footsteps, of hunger met with bread, of a stranger welcomed at the table. John closed his eyes, the prairie wind rattling against the shutters, and wondered, though he would never say it aloud, if the Lord had just begun to turn a new page in the story of his life. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. 3 days passed without a sign. John convinced himself the girl was gone for good, just another shadow swept away by the winds of the frontier. Yet on the 4th evening, as the sun bled into the hills and painted the sky in rust and fire, movement stirred near the fence. He set down the water bucket he was hauling from the well. His eyes narrowed against the dust, and there she was, the same child, hair still tangled, eyes still cautious. But this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a woman, tall, though her shoulders drooped from exhaustion, her face hollow, marked with lines too deep for her years. One arm hung awkwardly, wrapped in a dirty strip of cloth spotted with blood. Old scars trailed across her back and arms, the kind no honest work could explain. Still, her eyes, dark and sharp, burned with a fierceness that no wound could dim. The girl clung to the woman's skirt, half hidden behind her, though her gaze flicked toward John with something like hope. The woman stopped 30 feet from the gate. Her voice cracked when she spoke, as though it had been worn down by miles of pain and dust. "We have nowhere else to go. I can work, haul water, cook, tend livestock. I ask only, let us stay for the night." "Even under the porch, if nothing more." John stood still on the porch, his weathered hand brushing against the butt of the Winchester propped against the doorframe. He said nothing at first, his eyes fixed on the 2 figures, as the old dog at his feet let out a low growl before falling silent. The wind picked up, sending red dust across the fence rails and rattling the boards of the cabin. John's mind wandered, unbidden, back to a memory. His wife's voice, soft yet steady. "Don't turn your back on those in need, John. Some day it may be you." He let out a slow breath, then nodded once. With deliberate movements, he stepped down from the porch, unlatched the gate, and pulled it wide. "Come in," he said, his tone plain and without flourish. The woman hesitated, as if weighing whether this stranger's mercy might carry a hidden cost. But when the child tugged her sleeve, eyes bright with hunger, she gave a small nod and led her daughter forward. Inside the cabin, John stirred the fire back to life. He set what food remained on the table, a last loaf of cornbread, a pot of beans simmered from the day before. The woman eased herself into a chair, her body trembling from weariness. The child wasted no time, clutching the bowl in her hands, her tense face slowly softening as warmth spread through her. John glanced toward the folded blanket in the corner. He placed it near the hearth. "Sleep there," he said simply. The woman bowed her head, her voice unsteady with gratitude. "Thank you, sir." For the rest of that night, silence filled the cabin. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the kind carried on the breathing of others, on the soft sound of a child finally resting safe beside her mother. By the time morning light poured across the prairie, Elena was already awake. John stepped out of his room, expecting to find the cabin as he had left it. Scattered tools, dust layering the floorboards, shirts torn and forgotten over the back of a chair. Instead, he stopped short. The porch had been swept clean. His work shirt, long ripped at the sleeve, now lay folded neatly on the table, patched with rough but careful stitches. Elena moved quietly near the stove, her bandaged arm held close to her side as she stirred the pot. From a small cloth pouch tied at her waist, she added pinches of dried herbs, sage, juniper, and something else he didn't recognize. The scent rose slowly, filling the room with a warmth that was not just of food, but of memory. John's brow furrowed. He hadn't tasted anything seasoned in years. His meals were plain, beans boiled in water, bread baked until it was just enough to last the week. But the way she worked, deliberate yet gentle, carried a rhythm that softened the hard edges of the cabin. He said nothing. Instead, he reached for his hat and stepped outside to tend the cattle. It was there he found the girl, Naya. Her small hands clutched a bundle of hay nearly too large for her, yet she carried it with a stubborn determination. When she placed it in front of a calf, the animal nudged close, chewing slowly. The girl's eyes lit up, and she let out a laugh, soft, high-pitched, unguarded. John paused mid-step. The sound struck him harder than any memory. It had been years since laughter had touched this land. His cabin had long been a place of silence, broken only by wind and fire. But now, in the voice of a hungry child, the silence was cracked. He gave her a quiet nod. He did not smile, not yet, but the coldness in his gaze softened. By noon, when John returned from the fields, he noticed more changes. The floor swept clean, the chairs straightened. Even the window, long clouded with dust, now allowed sunlight to spill across the room. Elena sat by the fire, her shoulders tired but steady, mending another shirt with coarse thread. Her injured arm slowed her work, but her jaw was set with the determination of someone unwilling to remain idle. John lingered by the doorway longer than he meant to. The sight of someone else's hands touching his things, arranging, restoring, should have unsettled him. Instead, it pulled at something buried deep. That evening, supper was different. Elena ladled beans into bowls, the herbs she had used earlier giving the food a flavor John had nearly forgotten. He took a bite. Warmth spread across his tongue, unexpected and strangely comforting. He said nothing, but a subtle shift passed over his expression. Across the table, Naya let out another small giggle. The sound mingled with the crackle of the fire, rising gently into the rafters. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer sounded like a tomb. It sounded life. The sun rose sharp and unyielding, throwing long shadows across the yard. John shouldered the rope and headed for the well, but he wasn't the first one there. Elena stood near the bucket, her hair tied back loosely, her face pale but set with determination. Her left arm still wrapped in the stained bandage, she gripped the handle with her good hand and pulled. The rope strained, water sloshed, and her shoulders trembled under the weight. "Let me do it," she said firmly, her voice carrying no trace of weakness. John stopped a few steps away. Her stance told him she would fight anyone who dared to question her strength. For a moment he considered arguing, but instead he stepped forward, took the bucket from her hand and set it down beside the shed. No words passed between them. The gesture was enough. As he tied up the hay rack, he noticed a flicker of movement. Naya trotted into the shed, barefoot and dusty, clutching a small bundle of grass. She crouched in front of a calf, laying it gently at its feet. The calf lowered its head, chewing happily, and the girl's face lit with joy. John paused, the twine slack in his fingers. He looked at the girl, then at her mother standing in the doorway, silent but watchful. Something passed between them all, wordless, quiet, but binding. By midday, the prairie heat pressed down like an iron weight. John wiped sweat from his brow, hammering a loose fence rail back into place. He caught sight of Elena again, this time moving slowly through the field, balancing a bundle of dry grass against her hip. Each step looked painful, but she never faltered. When she drew near, John wordlessly took the bundle from her, hoisting it onto the cart. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a slight nod, nothing more. But the look in her gaze, steady, proud, unwilling to be pitied, spoke louder than any words. That evening, after the day's labor, the cabin settled into quiet. Firelight danced along the walls, shadows flickering with each pop of the wood. Naya curled on a blanket near the hearth, her small chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of sleep. Elena sat beside her, humming in a low voice. The melody was soft, drawn from her people's traditions, carrying the cadence of old songs sung beneath desert skies. The tune had no words John could understand, but the meaning was clear. It was a song of comfort, a promise that the child was safe. John sat in his chair, knife in hand, carving at a piece of wood. His eyes drifted from the blade to the fire, then to the woman's quiet figure bent over her daughter. The sound of her song lingered in the cabin long after the flames burned low. It was unlike anything he had heard before, yet it settled into the silence with ease, as though it had always belonged there. And for the first time in years, John realized the silence of his cabin was no longer empty, it was shared. The scent of cooking drifted through the cabin long before John stepped back inside. The day's work clung to his clothes, dust, sweat, and the faint tang of iron nails from mending the fence. But what reached him now was different. Beans simmered slowly with herbs, cornbread warming on the hearth, and the faint, sharp fragrance of sage. Elena stood over the pot, her movements steady despite the stiffness in her wounded arm. She ladled the beans into rough clay bowls, the steam rising in lazy curls. From her pouch, she added another pinch of dried leaves, stirring until the smell deepened. John hung his hat by the door, hesitating longer than he meant to. The cabin looked different in the glow of lamplight. The table had been wiped clean, chairs straightened, and a small bouquet of wildflowers, scraggly but bright, sat in a chipped cup at the center. Naya was already seated, her small hands folded in her lap, eyes wide with anticipation. "Sit," Elena said, her voice quiet but firm. John lowered himself into the chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He watched as Elena set the bowls before them. She said nothing more, simply sat down across from him, her posture upright, her eyes unreadable. For a moment, John stared at the food. The beans glistened with oil and herbs, the cornbread golden and warm. He had eaten this same meal 1,000 times, but never like this. He picked up his spoon, took a bite, and paused. The flavor spread slowly across his tongue, earthy, fragrant, rich with something more than just beans. He swallowed, and for the first time in years, a trace of warmth, not from fire but from food, settled in his chest. He said nothing, but a subtle change flickered in his expression. Across the table, Elena noticed. She did not smile, but her shoulders eased, her guarded posture softening as if she had won some small, unspoken victory. Naya, on the other hand, had no such restraint. She giggled, a small sound at first, light as a bird's wing, but then it spilled out, filling the cabin. She covered her mouth quickly, her eyes darting between her mother and John, as though unsure if laughter had a place here. John's gaze lingered on her. The sound tugged at something deep within him, a memory buried under years of silence. The laughter of a child, something he thought he would never hear again inside these walls. The fire popped, sending sparks drifting up the chimney. Shadows danced across the rough beams overhead. For a long while, the only sounds were spoons scraping bowls, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional giggle that Naya could no longer suppress. John leaned back in his chair, pipe resting idle in his hand. He didn't smile, not fully, but the lines around his eyes softened. The cabin, once heavy with silence, now carried the first notes of life. Not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to remind him that even in this harsh land, warmth could return. Night drew down heavy and still, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones. The wind outside swept across the plains, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and mesquite. Inside, the cabin glowed with the soft light of the fire. John sat at the table, his knife working slowly at a small block of cedar. Each curl of wood fell to the floor like shavings of time itself. He wasn't carving anything in particular, just keeping his hands busy, as he often did when silence pressed too close. Across from him, Elena bent over a shirt torn at the sleeve, pushing a needle through coarse fabric. The firelight caught the scars along her arm, shadows dancing over them like reminders that would never fade. Her face was steady, but her lips were tight, pressed against words she seemed to hold back. Naya had already fallen asleep near the hearth, her head resting on the wool blanket, one hand curled against her cheek. The soft rhythm of her breathing filled the room like a fragile promise. For a long while, only the fire spoke. Then Elena's voice broke the stillness. Low, hesitant, yet carrying a weight that filled the cabin. "You probably wonder how we ended up here." John didn't answer. He paused in his carving, set the piece of wood aside, and waited. Elena's eyes stayed fixed on the fabric in her lap. Her words came slowly, each one drawn from a well too deep to touch lightly. "We lived in Baker's Ridge. I belonged to a man there. He treated me as property, not as a wife. When I could not give him a son, he beat me, called me worthless. The whip marks, the broken arm." Her needle faltered for a moment, her hand trembling slightly. She lifted her bandaged arm, letting the firelight show what her voice could not. "These are from him." The words hovered in the room like smoke. She drew in a breath, steadied herself. "I could not take it any more. I took Naya and ran. Our feet bled crossing the hills, our stomachs empty, our legs raw. But I could not stay. I would rather die on the open land than live another day under his hand." The fire popped sharply, as if in response. John rose, walked to the hearth, and added another log to the flames. He didn't speak right away. He let the crackle of the wood fill the space, his gray eyes steady and unreadable. It was not pity in his gaze, nor judgment. It was something quieter, heavier, understanding, respect. He returned to the table, picked up the block of wood again, though he didn't carve. For a moment his lips parted, and he spoke in a voice low and rough. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147:3. Elena's hands stilled. Her eyes lifted, meeting his across the table. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, the wall around her seemed to ease, just slightly. No more words were exchanged that night. But in the silence, something unspoken took root, deeper than either of them yet realized. The night pressed in heavy, carrying with it the restless howl of coyotes far out on the prairie. The fire had burned low, throwing soft, uneven light across the cabin walls. John sat at the table, pipe unlit between his fingers, his thoughts circling like dust caught in the wind. Elena sat across from him, her mending finished, her hands folded in her lap. For a long time she said nothing, her gaze steady on the flames. Then, slowly, she spoke. "If he comes here, Cobb, I will leave. I don't want to bring his wrath to your doorstep." Her voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. She didn't look at John when she said it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire, as though she could already see shadows moving out there in the darkness. John set the pipe down, his jaw tightening. He studied her face, the lines carved deep by pain and endurance, the guarded strength in her eyes. She was prepared to run again, to keep running until her legs gave out, just to keep her daughter alive. He thought of the child curled up in the corner, wrapped in the wool blanket, her breathing soft and even. He thought of the laughter that had filled this cabin only hours ago, a sound he never believed he would hear again within these walls. And then he thought of his wife's voice, carried across years. "Don't turn your back on those in need." He leaned forward, his tone rough but firm. "No one has the right to drag you back to that hell, not while you and the girl stand on this land." Elena's head lifted sharply, her dark eyes searching his face. For a moment, confusion crossed her features, as though she hadn't expected such certainty. Then the confusion softened into something quieter, gratitude, and perhaps the faintest trace of relief. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Instead, she lowered her eyes again, her hands tightening in her lap. The firelight played along her scars, but in that moment she looked less like a fugitive and more like someone who, for the first time in years, had been told she belonged somewhere. The cabin settled into silence again, but it was no longer fragile. It carried a weight of its own, the weight of unspoken promises. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, rattling the fence posts and carrying dust through the cracks in the shutters. Inside, 3 lives shared the same small space: the rancher, the woman, the child. Each of them scarred, each of them alone, yet together forming something that resembled the shape of a family. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the fire. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew this: the cabin was no longer empty. And whatever storm might rise on the horizon, he would not face it alone. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The afternoon sky burned with the copper glow of a dying sun. Heat clung to the air, thick with dust, and the land stretched wide and unforgiven. John Callahan tightened the reins on his horse, preparing to lead it back to the corral, when the old dog at his feet bristled and let out a low growl. The sound of hooves followed, slow at first, then steady, like a drum beat rolling across the prairie. John lifted his head. On the road that cut through the red haze, a lone rider emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, the tilt of his frame carried the weight of someone who had taken more than he had ever given. As he drew closer, the fading light revealed a scar running from his cheek to his chin, white against sun-browned skin. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his mouth curled in a grin sharp as broken glass. John's jaw tightened. He didn't need an introduction. This man had a presence that filled the land like a storm. The rider reined in just beyond the fence, his horse stamping the ground, nostrils flaring against the dust. He let out a laugh, dry, mocking, cutting through the stillness. "So this is where you've been hiding, Elena?" John didn't move. He stood on the porch, tall and steady, his Winchester resting against the post. The old boards creaked beneath his boots as he shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the man who had just brought the past crashing down into the present. From behind the doorframe, Elena's hand gripped the wood so tightly her knuckles whitened. Naya clung to her skirt, wide-eyed, the child's small body trembling. The rider's voice rose again, full of arrogance. "You think you can run from me? You and the girl both. You belong to me." John stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, each one echoing the resolve of a man who had lived long enough to know the cost of hesitation. He lifted the Winchester, cocking it with a sharp, metallic click that shattered the silence like thunder. "She doesn't belong to anyone." The words hung in the air, heavy as iron. The rider's grin faltered, replaced by a flash of anger in his eyes. His hand hovered near the butt of his revolver. For a moment, the world shrank to the space between two men, the rancher standing firm at his gate and the intruder ready to claim what was never his. The dog growled again, the wind carrying dust across the fence, rattling the boards like bones. The rider spat into the dirt, his voice low and seething. "You'll regret this, Callahan. I'll be back, and next time I won't be alone." With a sharp jerk of the reins, he wheeled his horse around. Hooves pounded against the hard earth as he disappeared into the swirl of red dust, leaving the air heavy with the promise of violence yet to come. John lowered the rifle slowly, his gaze steady on the horizon long after the man had gone. There was no turning back now. The fight had found him. The dust had barely settled when John stepped back into the cabin. He leaned the Winchester against the wall by the door, the metallic click echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. His face was set like stone, but his eyes flickered briefly toward Elena. She stood near the hearth, her hand pressed against the edge of the table to steady herself. Her shoulders trembled despite her effort to hold them firm. Naya clung to her mother's skirt, her small face buried in the folds of cloth. The girl's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, the fear of what she had just seen still clinging to her like dust. John took off his hat and set it on the peg by the door. For a moment, he said nothing. The fire crackled, filling the silence with the steady rhythm of burning wood. Elena finally spoke, her voice raw, the words scraped thin. "It was him, Samuel Cobb. He found us." John nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I know." Her eyes searched his face, desperate, afraid. "You don't understand. He won't stop. He'll come back. And this time he'll bring others." The fear in her voice cut through the room sharper than any blade. John crossed to the window, pulled the curtain aside just enough to scan the darkening horizon. Empty fields stretched out beneath the setting sun, but the weight of her words lingered. Naya whimpered softly, pressing her face harder against her mother's leg. Elena lowered a hand, stroking the girl's hair, though her own fingers shook. John turned back toward them, his expression unchanged. He drew a slow breath and spoke in a voice rough but steady. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The words carried through the cabin, not loud, but with a quiet force that settled over the room like a shield. Elena looked up at him, startled, her dark eyes reflecting both the firelight and something softer, something she hadn't expected to find here. John moved to the table, lowered himself into the chair, and lit his pipe. He didn't take a draw, he simply held it, staring into the flames, his jaw set. Elena eased down beside her daughter, drawing Naya close. The child's breathing slowed, her eyelids heavy as exhaustion overcame fear. The cabin grew quiet once more, but it was a fragile quiet, stretched thin by the threat looming on the horizon. Outside, the prairie wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the shutters, carrying with it the memory of hooves pounding against the earth. John leaned back, his silhouette framed by the fire. He had lived with solitude for years, but now he understood. The moment he raised his rifle at the gate, the course of his life had changed. Cobb would return, and when he did, John Callahan would be ready. The night came heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the walls until every crack feels alive. John had barely finished tying down the last of the shutters when the dog growled again, low and steady. The sound of hooves followed, this time not one, but many. He stepped onto the porch, Winchester in hand. Dust rose in the distance, torches bobbing like restless stars. The rumble of horses grew louder, closer, until 4 riders broke through the haze. At their head sat Samuel Cobb, his scar catching the firelight, his eyes burning with hate.
They pulled up at the fence, the horses stamping and snorting against the heat. Cobb leaned forward in his saddle, voice rough and sharp. "Callahan, I gave you your chance. Hand over the woman and the girl, and I'll let you keep your land. Refuse, and we'll burn this place to the ground." John stood tall on the porch, the rifle firm in his hands. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it carried across the yard. "This is my land. No one takes them from here." For a moment, neither side moved. The torches flickered, sparks trailing into the dry night air. The silence stretched thin, ready to tear. Then one of Cobb's men let out a harsh laugh and hurled a torch into the fence. Dry wood caught instantly, flames leaping upward, smoke curling thick into the sky. Naya screamed from inside the cabin.
Elena pulled her close, dragging her away from the window as sparks rained down against the walls. Cobb raised his pistol, pointing it toward the porch. His grin was wide, cruel. "Fire!" The night exploded. Gunshots cracked through the air, splinters flying from the fence as bullets slammed into wood. Horses reared, snorting in panic, but the men pressed forward, shouting curses as they circled the yard. John dropped to one knee, the Winchester braced firm against his shoulder. He fired once. One of the riders jerked and fell, crashing hard into the dust. Smoke from the burning fence mingled with the dust storm kicked up by hooves, choking the air, turning the yard into a storm of fire and shadow. Inside, Elena yanked up in the cabinet by the hearth, pulling free the old hunting rifle John had left there. She checked the chamber with shaking hands, then pushed Naya behind the door. The girl's small voice trembled. "Mama." Elena bent low, her words sharp but steady. "Stay down. Do not move." Then she rose, rifle in hand, her figure framed by firelight and smoke. Outside, Cobb's laughter carried over the roar of flames.
"We'll see how long you can stand, Callahan." John chambered another round, his jaw clenched tight. He knew this was only the beginning. The fire spread fast, devouring the fence rails one by one, flames twisting high against the night sky. Smoke poured into the yard, stinging eyes, choking lungs, turning every breath into a battle. John crouched low on the porch, Winchester steady against his shoulder. His finger tightened, the crack of the rifle splitting the chaos. Another rider jerked sideways in his saddle, tumbling hard into the dirt. Bullets whined past, splinters exploding from the porch rail. John shifted, rolling to the side as another shot shattered the post where his head had been. His jaw clenched, his gray eyes cold, steady. This was no longer just his ranch. This was his line in the sand. Through the haze of fire and dust, he caught sight of Elena stepping onto the porch. The hunting rifle shook slightly in her grip, but her stance was strong. She leveled the barrel at a rider charging through the smoke and fired. The man's horse screamed, rearing, throwing its rider into the dirt. Cobb cursed, his voice rising above the din.
"You think you can fight me, woman?" Elena's answer came sharp, her voice cutting through smoke and gunfire. "I'm not yours. Not now, not ever." Naya, hidden just inside the doorway, peeked through the crack of the wood. Her small hands clutched the edge of the doorframe, her body trembling. She saw her mother standing tall against the fire, rifle in hand, hair wild with wind and smoke. Terror welled in her chest, but mingled with it was something new, pride. Gunfire roared again. John fired back, each shot deliberate, each movement honed from years of hard living. Dust swirled around him, the night turned into a storm of sparks and smoke. One of Cobb's men circled wide, torch in hand, aiming for the cabin itself. John spotted him through the haze, swung his rifle, and dropped him before the torch ever reached the wall. The body fell hard, flames sputtering into the dirt. But the fight was far from over.
Cobb pressed forward, pistol flashing in the firelight, rage twisting his scarred face. He fired wildly toward the porch, bullets gouging deep into the wood. John ducked low, chambering another round. He caught Elena's eye for just a heartbeat. No words passed between them, only the silent understanding of two people who had decided this fight would be the one they stood together. Naya's breath caught as her mother fired again, the recoil jolting her shoulder. Smoke filled her lungs, tears stung her eyes, but she could not look away. She would remember this night forever, the night her mother refused to bow, and the stranger who had opened his gate became their shield. The yard was a storm now, flames, bullets, dust, and defiance. And in the heart of it stood John Callahan and Elena, fighting not just for land, but for the right to call it home. The fight raged on, smoke choking the air, flames licking higher as the fence collapsed in glowing embers. Gunfire rattled through the yard, each shot echoing across the prairie like thunder. John braced himself against a post, sighting down the Winchester. He fired, dropping another man, but in the same breath a bullet tore across his shoulder. The impact spun him sideways, heat flaring down his arm. He stumbled, teeth gritted against the pain, one hand pressed hard to the wound. Elena cried out, but John raised his free hand sharply, silencing her. His eyes stayed fixed on the yard, gray and unyielding. He would not fall, not here, not while they watched. Blood seeped through his shirt, dark against the fabric, but he worked the lever of the Winchester again, the motion steady despite the tremor in his arm. Another shot rang out, forcing one of Cobb's men to pull back, cursing as he retreated into the haze. Cobb urged his horse forward, fury blazing across his scarred face. A bullet had grazed his side earlier, streaking his shirt with blood, and the wound only deepened his rage. He lifted his revolver and fired blindly toward the porch, his voice raw with hate. "You can't stop me, Callahan. You think this little fight changes anything? I own this land, and I own her." Elena stepped forward, rifle in hand, her voice fierce and unshaken despite the smoke tearing at her throat. "You own nothing, Samuel, not me, not my child, and never this home." Her words cut through the chaos, a declaration that made Cobb's jaw clench with rage. He fired again, the bullet striking the porch beam inches from her shoulder, splinters flying. John steadied himself, lifted the Winchester with his wounded arm screaming in protest, and fired. The round grazed Cobb's arm, ripping through the sleeve and drawing blood. Cobb howled, his horse rearing violently beneath him. For a heartbeat, man and beast fought each other in the smoke and fire. Then Cobb wrenched the reins, pulling the animal under control. His face twisted with hate, spittle flying from his lips as he shouted to his men. "Fall back! This isn't finished! Next time, I bring the whole damned town!" With that, he jerked his horse around, retreating into the storm of dust and flame. His remaining men followed, some wounded, others clutching their rifles tight as they fled. The sound of hooves faded into the night, swallowed by the roar of burning wood and the sharp crackle of fire. John lowered the Winchester, his breath ragged. Blood streaked down his arm, staining his hand, but his stance remained tall. He scanned the yard through the drifting smoke, ensuring the last rider had gone before finally letting the rifle drop to his side. Behind him, Elena rushed forward, catching his arm to steady him. Her eyes were wide with fear, but also with something else: relief, pride, and the dawning recognition that this battle had bound them together in ways words could never fully name. The fire still burned, the fence lay in ruins, but the cabin still stood, scarred, battered, but unbroken, and so did they. The gunfire faded, leaving behind only the crackle of fire and the smell of smoke hanging thick in the air.
The fence was gone, little more than glowing embers scattered across the yard. The ground was littered with splintered wood and churned dust, dark stains marking where men had fallen. Inside the cabin, Naya whimpered softly, her small body curled tight beneath the wool blanket. Elena gathered her close, her own shoulders trembling now that the fight was over. She pressed her cheek against her daughter's hair, whispering words in her native tongue, half prayer, half lullaby, anything to quiet the child's fear. John staggered back into the doorway, his shirt torn and soaked through with blood from the wound on his shoulder. His breathing was heavy, each draw of air ragged, but his eyes were steady, cold gray softened only by exhaustion.
He leaned the Winchester against the wall and lowered himself into a chair. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence after battle is its own weight, a heavy stillness that makes even the smallest sound sharp. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the stove. Outside, the prairie wind carried away the last echo of hooves. Elena lifted her head, her eyes searching John's face. She wanted to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Gratitude felt too small for what had just happened. Instead, she simply held Naya tighter, her gaze trembling yet resolute. John met her eyes across the dim room. He didn't speak either, but his look carried the words she needed. "You're safe here. You don't run anymore." Naya stirred in her sleep, one small hand loosening its grip on her mother's dress. Elena brushed the hair from the girl's face, her own lips tightening to keep back tears. She had run for so long, from shadows, from pain, from the man who had once claimed her as his. Tonight, for the first time, she had stood her ground, and she had not stood alone. John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like gravel scraped against wood.
"This place is scarred now, but it's still standing. So are we." Elena's lips parted, but still no words came. Only a faint nod, her eyes shining with the quiet fire of someone who had survived the storm. The cabin seemed to breathe with them. Its walls, marked by smoke and bullet holes, no longer felt empty. They had been tested by fire, and though the scars would remain, the silence that followed was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of belonging. John leaned back in his chair, pipe untouched in his hand, and stared into the flames. For years, he had lived as though nothing in the world could reach him. Tonight had proved him wrong. And strangely, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like the beginning of something he had almost forgotten how to hope for. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. Winter passed slowly, dragging its sharp winds across the prairie. The scars of battle remained, blackened fence posts, bullet holes in the porch beams, and the faint char marks that streaked the cabin walls.
Yet when spring came, it came quietly, as if the land itself longed for healing. Green pushed through the earth where dust had ruled. Grass rose in soft blades, trembling in the wind. Wildflowers dotted the open fields, stubborn and bright against the scars of fire. Birds returned, their songs lilting across the yard where once only gunfire had echoed. John Callahan leaned on his hoe, wiping the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the field. His shoulder still ached where the bullet had grazed him, a silver scar tracing the memory of that night. But the arm held strong, and the soil turned beneath his hands. Beside him, Elena knelt, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, planting seeds into rows of fresh earth. The old wound in her arm had not fully healed, yet she worked with the steady determination of someone who had chosen this place and would not turn back. Her hair, unbound, caught the sunlight, and her face, once drawn by fear, now bore the strength of resolve. On the porch, Naya sat cross-legged, stacking stones into a circle.
her laughter carrying like a small bell in the wind.
Every so often she looked up, calling out, "Mama says we'll have corn taller than me this year." John's mouth tugged into something that was almost a smile. He straightened his back, resting the hoe against his shoulder, and replied with a rough chuckle, "If the rains come, I reckon we just might." The girl giggled, brushing hair from her face, before turning back to her project. The sound of her laughter no longer startled John. It had become a part of the land itself, something expected, something welcome. By evening, the three of them sat together beneath the shade of the old oak. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. John passed the water jug to Elena. She drank, then handed it back with a look that lingered a moment longer than before. Naya shared what remained of roasted corn from her small pouch, pressing a handful into John's calloused hand. He accepted it without words, only a quiet nod of thanks. The cabin behind them bore its scars, but within those walls was a warmth no bullet could burn away. At night, when the fire flickered across the wooden beams, the silence no longer felt empty. It carried the sound of Elena humming soft songs from her people, the sound of Naya breathing deep in her sleep, and the low rasp of John's knife carving wood into shapes he had not touched in years. One evening, as twilight deepened, Elena paused in her work and glanced at John. Her voice was low, thoughtful. "Back in the tribe, I never believed I'd find a home like this, a place where the land holds both scars and hope." John didn't answer right away. He looked out across the prairie, the horizon glowing beneath the last light of day. Then he nodded, slow and steady. "This land's been broken plenty, so have we, but broken things can still grow." Elena's eyes softened, her lips curving in the faintest smile. She turned back toward Naya, who had fallen asleep against her mother's lap, a stone still clutched in her hand. The prairie wind swept across them, gentle now, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. For the first time in years, John felt the weight of solitude lift, replaced by something he dared not name too quickly, but he knew it was real. They were no longer running, they were planting, and planting was a promise of tomorrow. Night fell soft over the prairie. A crescent moon hung low, spilling pale light across the fields where young shoots of corn swayed in the evening wind. The scars of fire and gunshots still marked the land, yet life had returned. From the cabin window, lamplight glowed like a beacon against the vast dark. Inside, the small room was alive with quiet warmth. The fire in the stove crackled steady, throwing golden shadows across the walls. Naya lay curled on the blanket near the hearth, her small chest rising and falling in sleep, her face peaceful in the glow of the flames. Elena sat at the table, stitching another shirt with steady hands. Her movements were practiced now, no longer driven only by necessity, but by a quiet care. She looked up from her work and glanced across the room at John. He sat in his chair, pipe resting unlit between his fingers, carving another small piece of wood into the shape of a fishing lure. His gray eyes were tired, lined by years of solitude and loss, but tonight they carried something else, something lighter, as though the weight he had carried alone for so long had finally been set down. Elena broke the silence, her voice soft but clear. "You know, I never thought I would have this. Not after all the running, not after all the pain. A place that feels like home." Her words hung in the air, not demanding an answer, but waiting. John set down the carving, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He studied the fire for a long moment before speaking. "I buried my wife not far from here, thought the Lord had finished with me, thought this house would never be more than wood and stone again." His voice roughened, not with sorrow, but with something closer to awe. "But then you knocked on my door, and now this place doesn't feel empty anymore." Elena's eyes softened. She set aside the shirt, folding her hands in her lap. The scars on her arm caught the firelight, reminders of the past that had once defined her. But tonight, those scars seemed less like chains and more like markers of survival.
Maybe the Lord wasn't finished with either of us, she whispered. John looked up at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a slow nod, his gaze steady. Maybe he was just waiting for the right time. The words settled into the room like a benediction, quiet but sure. Naya stirred in her sleep, mumbling something before turning over and settling again. Elena rose, smoothing the blanket over her daughter. She lingered for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face, before returning to the table. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying the scent of new grass and turned soil. Inside, the cabin no longer held the weight of loneliness. Its silence was filled with breath, with small movements, with the unspoken bond of 3 lives tied together by fire, blood, and grace. John leaned back in his chair, the knife and wood resting idle in his hands. He looked across at Elena, her face calm in the glow of firelight, and then at the sleeping child who had once arrived hungry and afraid at his gate. Something long buried stirred within him, a quiet hope that this land, scarred as it was, could still hold life, love, and tomorrow. He exhaled slowly, words forming not as a vow, but as a truth already alive among them. This is home, and we're not alone anymore. The fire burned low, the shadows deepened, and the little cabin nestled against the endless prairie seemed to breathe along with them.
Outside, the stars stretched wide and eternal, but inside, in the warmth of that wooden house, loneliness had finally gone. Dear friends, as we close this chapter, perhaps you too felt the dust of the frontier and the warmth of a fire after a long, lonely road. Stories like John, Elena, and Naya's remind us that even in the harshest land, kindness can build a home, and courage can protect it. Maybe it stirs memories of your own, of times when someone opened a gate for you, or when faith carried you through shadows into light. The frontier was never just about guns and cattle. It was about people who chose compassion over fear and love over silence. These are the true Wild West stories worth remembering. If this tale touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to join me for more stories, and let us keep the spirit of the West alive together. Until next time, may hope ride with you.